Methew grew up surrounded by love and faith. Born into a devoted Christian family, his parents raised him with open hearts, always eager to teach him about God. They prayed together, their hands gently clasped, and every Sunday their voices would rise in hymns at church. Methew watched his parents, admiring their strength and dedication, but as he grew older, something began to change inside him. He longed for freedom, adventure, and a life beyond the boundaries of faith. Instead of embracing his parents' teachings, Methew started spending his time at parties, meeting new women, and enjoying the rush of a carefree life. The thrill of the night called to him, far louder than any sermon. But at home, his parents noticed with growing worry. They would sit him down, their eyes filled with both love and sadness, saying, "Methew, you need to change your ways. Think about becoming a pastor, dedicating your life to God." But Methew would shake his head and laugh, brushing it off with a careless, "That's not my life." He craved the feeling of living without rules or responsibilities, enjoying the freedom that came with it. One evening, however, his mother's sadness became impossible to ignore. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen with unshed tears. She took his hands, her voice barely a whisper, as she said, "Methew, I love you so much. If you don't change, I don't know what will happen to you. Watching you throw your life away is breaking me. I don't think I can bear it any longer." Her words hit him like a wave, washing away his defenses. He had never seen his mother like this before. Her pain felt like a weight pressing down on him, making him realize the cost of his choices, not just to himself but to those he loved. His heart ached, and for the first time he began to rethink his path. Not just for himself, but for his family, he decided he had to make a change. Reluctantly, he agreed to return to God. When he told his mother, face softened, relief flooding her expression as she hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Methew," she whispered. "I always knew you'd find your way back." Slowly, with his parents' encouragement, Methew embraced his new path and eventually opened his own small church. At first, his days were filled with hope. The church was warm, filled with people eager to hear him speak about love, faith, and kindness. He felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing he was sharing something meaningful. His parents were proud, and Methew felt his heart swell with fulfillment. But one day things began to shift. A nearby pastor named Jerry had recently opened a church, and the news spread quickly. Jerry was performing miracles, healing the sick, easing people's suffering, and drawing crowds from all around. People from Methew's congregation began to leave, their seats left empty, their once familiar faces now absent. He heard rumors Pastor Jerry's church is full of miracles, real miracles. The quiet of his own church felt heavy, and he could sense his heart starting to sink. Doubt began creeping in. He started questioning himself, wondering if he was doing enough, or if he was even meant to be a pastor. Unlike Pastor Jerry, he couldn't heal the sick or make miracles happen. His sermons were simple messages of love, faith, and a good life. One Sunday, as he looked out at the sparse congregation, his heart tightened. His confidence wavered. "Maybe I'm not a good enough pastor," he thought. "Maybe they don't need someone like me." That night, he shared his worries with his parents. His mother, sensing his sadness, held his hand. "Methew," she began gently, "do you remember why you started this journey? It wasn't about performing miracles. It was about spreading the message of love and faith. God has a plan, even if we can't see it yet. Trust in Him, and He will guide you." Her words filled him with a new resolve. He realized he needed to stay true to himself, even if his path wasn't filled with miracles. Every morning he woke up early, renewed in his purpose. He walked the streets sharing messages of love and forgiveness with anyone who would listen. His voice was steady, filled with quiet hope. One morning, a familiar face approached him. It was a woman who had once been a loyal member of his church, but had left to follow Pastor Jerry. Her gaze was sharp, her expression unkind as she looked at him. "Look at you, Pastor Methew," she scoffed. "You call yourself a pastor, but you don't perform miracles. I used to go to your church, but I stopped. Your church is empty, just words with no power behind them." Her words stung, each one a painful reminder of what he couldn't offer. But Methew stood firm, his heart steady, knowing that his purpose was rooted not in miracles, but in love and faith. Methew felt her words pierce his heart, yet he tried to stay calm. "I know Pastor Jerry's church is popular and people are drawn to miracles," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But God's message is more than just miracles. It's about faith, love, and trusting in God, even when we don't see immediate signs." The woman laughed, shaking her head. "Miracles are proof that God is present," she said defiantly. "If you were truly working for God, you'd perform miracles too. That's why I stopped going to your nonsense church." As she walked away, her words echoed in Methew's mind, each one like a weight on his soul. He stood there, feeling defeated, his heart sinking. He wanted people to feel welcome in his church, to find comfort and hope there, but he couldn't force anyone to stay. Her final words repeated over and over, haunting him. "If you want people to come to your church, start showing God's power. Words aren't enough." That evening, Methew returned home, tired and frustrated. He sat beside his mother, his shoulders slumped. "Mom, I'm done," he said, his voice filled with exhaustion. "This isn't the life I want. People are leaving my church because I don't perform miracles. No one believes in me anymore." His mother looked at him with gentle, wise eyes. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Methew, I know this is hard, but remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. Be strong, be patient. With time, your church will grow. Trust in God and don't give up." But Methew, overwhelmed with doubt and frustration, shook his head and left, unable to listen. He stormed out of the house, walking alone under the moonlight. The street was quiet, only his footsteps echoing in the stillness. His mind was clouded with questions, doubts, and a sense of failure. He wondered if he was even meant to be a pastor. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an old man appeared in his path. Methew stopped, startled by the figure before him. The man had a wise, almost mystical presence. His hair and beard were white as snow, and his eyes sparkled with a mysterious light. "Methew, my son," the old man spoke softly, his voice warm and calm. "I can see you're troubled. Tell me, what weighs so heavily on your heart?" Methew was taken aback, having never seen this man before. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and a hint of caution. The old man smiled, a gentle yet knowing smile. "I am here to help. I know about your church and I know how hard you've tried. But let me tell you a secret, Methew. Pastor Jerry doesn't rely on faith alone to perform miracles. If you want your church to grow like his, you must go the spiritual way." A chill ran down Methew's spine as he whispered, "Are you saying he uses dark powers?" The old man nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. "Yes, Methew. There are powers that can make miracles happen, but they are not from God. If you truly want people to believe in you, you can use these powers too." Methew's heart pounded as he shook his head firmly. "No, that goes against everything I believe. I want people to come to my church for God's love, not tricks." The old man's expression softened and he nodded with understanding. "I respect that. But remember, Methew, if you ever change your mind, just shout Great One 3 times, and I will appear. I can give you the power you desire." With that, the old man melted back into the shadows, disappearing as swiftly as he had appeared. Methew was left alone, the streets silent and empty once more. He walked home, his mind racing, the old man's words swirling around in his head. As he lay in bed that night, the temptation lingered like a dark cloud hanging over him. But deep down, he knew it was wrong. He clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "No, I won't do it. I want to do this the right way." He took a deep breath, finding a moment of peace, and decided, tomorrow, I'll go to Pastor Jerry. I'll ask him to show me the way. Methew lay in bed that night, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a while. His decision was clear. He would approach Pastor Jerry, ask for his guidance, and learn how to grow his church the right way. As he closed his eyes, he whispered a silent prayer, hoping that tomorrow would bring him closer to his dream. The next morning, he dressed in his best suit, his resolve strong. When he arrived at Pastor Jerry's office, he felt a strange mix of admiration and envy. Taking a deep breath, he greeted the pastor with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Pastor Jerry. I came here to learn from you. I want my church to be as full and lively as yours." Pastor Jerry's brows furrowed with a hint of confusion. "What do you mean, Methew?" he asked, his voice steady. Methew swallowed, gathering his courage. "I know you use special powers to perform miracles," he replied, his voice a mix of desperation and hope. "Please show me how to make my church grow like yours." Pastor Jerry's expression darkened, his face hardening. "What are you saying, Methew?" His voice grew stern. "I don't use any special powers. Everything I do is through the power of God. How dare you come here and accuse me like this?" But Methew, blinded by frustration, refused to believe him. "Stop lying," he shouted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Your church has only been open a few months, and you already have 2 branches. People say you heal the sick and make miracles happen. I know it's not just God's power. Show me how to do it." Pastor Jerry's patience snapped. He stood abruptly, pointing to the door. "Methew, you lack faith and trust in God's will. You think miracles are just tricks, and you've allowed doubt to cloud your heart. Get out of my church and don't come back." The word stung, leaving Methew feeling humiliated and alone. He turned and left, his steps heavy, his mind spiraling with shame and confusion. As he walked back to his office, he wondered if he'd ever find a way to make his church grow without compromising his beliefs. Back in the quiet of his office, the weight of his desperation settled in. He thought of the old man's mysterious words the night before. Fear and temptation battled within him, but he couldn't ignore the possibility of gaining power. Finally, with a shiver of excitement and dread, he whispered into the silence, "Grade 1, Grade 1, Grade 1. Suddenly, the room seemed to pulse, the air shimmering as though charged with invisible energy. A deep, booming laugh echoed, and the old man appeared before him, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Ah, Methew," he said with a sly smile. "I knew you would call on me. Your desperation speaks louder than words." Methew's heart raced. He felt a mixture of awe and fear as he asked, "What do I need to do?" The old man's smile grew, his beard fluttering gently in an unseen breeze. "If you truly seek power, then you must go on a journey to another world." The words filled Methew with both terror and intrigue. "Another world? What does that mean?" The old man's eyes sparkled, and his voice dropped to a low, almost hypnotic tone. "This world is full of secrets and magic, but it's dangerous. You'll need to complete certain rituals to gain the powers you desire. Are you ready for this journey?" Methew took a deep, trembling breath, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. But his desire to prove himself and to help his church was stronger than his fear. "Yes," he replied, his voice resolute. "I'm ready." "Good," the old man said with a slow nod. "But remember, you must follow my instructions carefully. The journey is long, and only the brave survive it." With a wave of his hand, the room around Methew began to blur, the walls melting away like mist, until he found himself standing at the edge of a dark, looming forest. Tall trees towered over him, their twisted branches reaching skyward like bony fingers. A cold mist hung low, swirling around his feet, and the air was thick with strange earthy scents. Methew shivered as a chill ran down his spine. The forest was silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional, distant roar of something he couldn't see. "Follow the path and do not stray from it," the old man's voice echoed in his ears, though he was nowhere to be seen. "This journey will take you to the spiritual realm. You'll need to find 3 magical items to complete the rituals." Methew nodded, his pulse racing with both fear and excitement. He took his first step onto the narrow, winding path, his footsteps barely a whisper against the soft forest floor. Shadows moved around him, and whispers floated through the air, mingling with the sound of rustling leaves and distant growls. Hours seemed to pass as he walked, each step taking him deeper into the unknown. Finally, he reached a small clearing bathed in a dim, otherworldly light, where he saw his first challenge awaiting him. Here's an enriched, immersive version of this part of Methew's journey, with added sensory details and emotional depth. Methew's eyes widened as he spotted the first magical item, a shining golden feather floating gently above a small pond, its radiant glow casting a warm light in the otherwise dim surroundings. Mesmerized, he reached out to grab it, but a sudden rustling in the shadows made him freeze. Turning, he saw a towering, dark creature emerging from the trees, its fiery red eyes piercing through the gloom. It let out a low, menacing growl that sent a chill down Methew's spine. Methew's heart pounded wildly, but he knew he had to act quickly. Summoning all his courage, he shouted, "Leave me alone," trying to sound braver than he felt. The creature snarled but paused, seemingly taken aback by his defiance. In that moment, Methew seized the golden feather. As his fingers closed around it, a warm light burst forth, wrapping around him like a protective shield. The creature shrieked in fear and retreated into the shadows, its roars fading as it vanished. Breathing heavily, Methew steadied himself, feeling the feather's energy pulsing through him. He knew he had to press on. Following the path, he soon arrived at a dark cave, eerie and silent. Inside, he glimpsed the second item, a glowing blue crystal resting on a pedestal. But as he stepped closer, a swirling mist rose from the ground, its cold whispers filling the air. "Only the true-hearted can pass," it hissed, words curling like smoke. Methew paused, reflecting on his journey. His purpose was clear, to serve God and help others. Gathering his resolve, he lifted his chin and declared boldly, "I want to serve God and help others." Instantly, the mist parted, allowing him to approach. He grasped the blue crystal, and a surge of energy shot through him, invigorating his spirit. His heart beat with renewed strength as he continued on. At last, he reached his final challenge, a steep mountain path, where the third item, a silver chalice, awaited him at the summit. The wind howled as he climbed, its icy blast pushing against him as if trying to force him back. He stumbled on the rocky path but pressed forward, each step fueled by his determination. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the top, where the chalice gleamed with an ethereal glow. Exhausted but triumphant, Methew carefully picked it up, feeling an intense surge of power flow through him. With the golden feather, blue crystal, and silver chalice in hand, he was filled with both excitement and fear, wondering what his journey had truly prepared him for. As he turned to leave, he noticed the old man standing at the edge of the mountain, his grin wide and knowing. "You've done well, Methew," he said, his voice a mixture of pride and caution. "Now return to your world, and the power you seek will be yours. But remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Use it wisely." With a sweep of his hand, the old man opened a shimmering portal. Methew stepped through, his heart heavy with the choices he'd made. He emerged back in his small office, clutching the golden feather, blue crystal, and silver chalice. The weight of his journey and the power he'd gained settled on his shoulders. He knew this was only the beginning. The next day, Methew awoke feeling an odd, tingling energy within him. Dressed in his finest clothes, he stepped into the streets with newfound confidence. A small crowd had gathered around a crippled man who couldn't walk, their faces full of pity and hope. Methew felt a rush of excitement. This was his chance to prove his power. He approached the man, extended his hand, and said, "Rise and walk." His voice was steady, filled with faith. But as he stretched out his hand, nothing happened. The man looked at him, confused, and a murmur began to spread through the crowd. Then came the first mocking laugh, sharp and cutting. "Look at this fake pastor," one man shouted, his voice dripping with scorn. He promised a miracle, but nothing happened. Another joined in, laughing, "What a fraud. He's just a liar." Methew's face flushed with embarrassment, his heart sinking as the crowd's voices grew louder, calling him a phony. Overwhelmed with shame, he turned and fled, his steps echoing through the empty streets. When he finally reached the solitude of his church, he slammed the door behind him, his heart pounding with anger and confusion. Frustrated and filled with rage, Methew called out into the empty church, "Great One, Great One, Great One." Suddenly the air around him chilled, and the old man appeared with a sly smile, his eyes gleaming as if he had been waiting all along. Well, Methew," he sneered, "what's wrong?" Methew's face flushed with anger. "Why did you lie to me?" he shouted, his voice echoing. "You promised me powers, but nothing happened. I was humiliated." The old man chuckled, a dark sound that seemed to linger in the air. "Ah, I forgot to mention one tiny detail. There's a fourth step to the ritual." A cold knot formed in Methew's stomach. "A fourth step," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You never told me that. What is it?" The old man's face grew serious, his gaze unyielding. "You need to make a sacrifice. A human sacrifice." Methew's eyes widened in horror. "Are you kidding me? A human sacrifice? This is madness." The old man's expression hardened. "No, it's not madness. It's power. If you desire true power, you must be willing to sacrifice what you love most." Methew took a step back, fear prickling at the back of his neck. Who do I have to sacrifice?" The old man looked deeply into Methew's eyes, his voice cold and deliberate. "Tell me, Methew, who do you love most in this world?" Methew's heart pounded as he thought of his family. With a shiver, he whispered, "My mother, she's always supported me, always believed in me." The old man's smile turned dark, his eyes gleaming with sinister satisfaction. "Yes, your mother. She is the one you must sacrifice." A wave of horror washed over Methew. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "You're insane. I would never harm my mother." The old man's eyes narrowed, his smile fading into a cruel sneer. "Watch your tongue," he warned, his voice laced with menace. "If you truly want the power you've asked for, this is the only way. You have 3 days to decide." Methew felt trapped, his heart heavy with dread. He wanted power desperately, but the thought of harming his mother was unbearable. What if I don't do it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man's gaze darkened. "If you refuse, the power you sought will turn against you. In 3 days you will lose your mind and die." With those chilling words, the old man vanished, leaving Methew alone in the silent, empty church. His warning echoed in Methew's mind like a curse. Methew sank to his knees, overwhelmed by fear and sadness, realizing his ambition had led him down a dark and dangerous path. He felt utterly lost, torn between his love for his mother and the promise of power. That night, Methew returned home with tears in his eyes, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. As he entered the house, his father noticed his sadness and gently asked, "Methew, what's wrong? Why are you so upset?" At first, Methew didn't answer. He shook his head, trying to hold back his tears. But his father's concern was unyielding, and finally Methew offered a half-truth. "I'm losing members every day at the church. People are leaving because they don't see any miracles. I feel like a failure." His father placed a comforting hand on Methew's shoulder, looking deeply into his eyes. "Methew," he said softly, "you must be patient. Faith takes time. It's not about quick results or grand gestures. Don't let yourself be tempted by shortcuts." Later that night, as Methew lay in bed, the air around him grew cold. He turned to see the old man standing at his bedside, holding a deep red cloth in his hands. His eyes gleamed in the dim light as he looked at Methew with a stern, serious expression. "Take this cloth," the old man commanded, his voice cold and unyielding. "Go to your mother's room and cover her with it while she sleeps. Only then will the power be yours." Methew's heart pounded as he took the cloth, feeling its strange, heavy weight in his hands. A wave of doubt crashed over him, but the old man's warning echoed in his mind. If he didn't complete the ritual, he would lose his mind and his life. Quietly, he tiptoed down the hall to his mother's room. The door creaked as he entered, and he saw her lying peacefully, her face soft in the moonlight, her breathing steady. Methew hesitated, his gaze lingering on her gentle face. Memories of her love and support flooded his mind, and he felt his resolve falter. But the pressure of the old man's words grew louder, his warnings ringing in his head. With a trembling hand, Methew finally pulled the cloth over her, covering her completely. The next morning, Methew's father went to check on his wife, as he did every morning, expecting to see her warm smile greeting him. But today the room was silent. A chill ran through him as he approached the bed. He gently touched her hand. It was cold, lifeless. She didn't move, didn't breathe. A wave of shock and horror washed over him, filling his chest with a hollow ache. He sank to his knees beside her, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "No, no, please wake up," he whispered, his voice trembling. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched her hand, his heart breaking as he realized she was truly gone. The emptiness and sorrow flooded him, leaving him feeling as if his own strength had faded away with her. His cries filled the quiet house, a sound of raw grief that echoed down the hall. Hearing his father's sobs, Methew slowly entered the room, his face tense and drawn. He looked down at his mother's still form, his father beside her, broken and shaking. A storm raged inside Methew's heart, pain, guilt, and fear all tangled together. He wanted to look away, to escape the scene, but he couldn't. He was the reason she was gone. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, Methew knelt beside his father. He let tears fall down his face, some genuine for the loss of the mother he dearly loved, but many were tears of guilt, knowing he had brought this tragedy upon her. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, Mother," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Why did this happen?" His father clutched his wife's hand even tighter, his face full of heartache, too consumed by his own grief to notice the shadow of guilt lingering in Methew's eyes. 2 days after his mother's funeral, Methew returned to his church for the Sunday service. He felt exhausted and burdened, sadness clinging to him like a heavy cloak. But when he arrived at the church, his mood shifted instantly. He was stunned to see the building packed with people. Every seat was filled, and many stood outside, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the service through windows and doors. Methew felt a rush of excitement, pride swelling within him. At that moment he thought, "My sacrifice has finally paid off." As he stood before the crowd, he felt their eyes on him, their respect palpable. For the first time, Methew felt powerful, a strength surging through him that he had never felt before. introducing himself as Prophet Methew with a voice full of authority. He delivered his message with energy and conviction. The crowd listened closely, nodding, moved by his words. Suddenly, a woman pushed through the throng, leading a blind man by the hand. She brought him to the front, her voice pleading, "Prophet Methew, please help him. He cannot see. Pray for his sight to be restored." Methew felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He remembered the old man's promise that with his mother's sacrifice, he would gain true power. Raising his hands, he began to pray aloud, calling for the man's sight to be returned. The entire crowd fell silent, holding their breath, eyes fixed on the blind man. Then, as if in answer to their prayers, the man blinked, his eyes widening in shock. He looked around, his face lighting up with astonishment. "I can see. I can see," he cried out, his voice filled with joy as he gazed at the world around him for the first time. The crowd gasped, then erupted in cheers, clapping, and tears of joy. Some cried openly, praising Methew, calling him a true prophet. Word of the miracle spread quickly through the town, and people flocked to his church, eager to witness the power of Prophet Methew. Methew felt happiness and pride unlike anything he had ever experienced, basking in the admiration and respect from the people around him. As weeks passed, his church grew at an astonishing pace. Every Sunday, the pews overflowed with people, and rumors spread of even more miracles taking place during each service. But as the church thrived, an unease began to stir within Methew's father. He saw the church's rapid growth, and whispers around town reached his ears, whispers that left him feeling unsettled. Rumors began to swirl in town, whispers carried from one person to the next. People talked in hushed voices, saying that Methew's rapid success seemed unnatural. Some even suggested he might have used his own mother in some kind of dark ritual to gain his powers. Troubled by these rumors, Methew's father decided to confront him. One evening, he called Methew into the room, gesturing for him to sit down. He looked his son squarely in the eyes, his expression serious but gentle. Methew began quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Methew's face grew tense, sensing his father's unease. "What is it, Father?" he asked, already feeling defensive. His father took a deep breath, hesitating as he struggled to find the words. "I've been hearing things, strange things about how fast your church is growing. Some people are even saying," he paused, unable to believe the words himself. "They're saying you might have done something wrong to gain all this power, that you used your own mother in some sort of ritual." Methew's face darkened, a spark of anger flaring in his eyes. "How could you think that, Father?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I am a man of God. I prayed and God answered me with his power. How could you even consider these vile rumors?" His father stayed calm, though his gaze was sad, his face lined with worry. "I just want to make sure, Methew. The way things change so quickly, it doesn't feel natural. I've seen many churches grow, but never this fast." Methew clenched his fists, a mixture of anger and guilt churning inside him, though he tried to hide it. "You don't have faith, Father," he spat. "Instead of supporting me, you believe these lies. And why don't you come to my church anymore? Why don't you see for yourself the miracles that happen there?" His father sighed, looking down. "Methew, I pray for you every day. But remember this, there is no shortcut to true faith. Miracles don't come from just anywhere. Be careful, my son." Methew's heart pounded, his face flushing with anger. "I don't need this," he said sharply. "I'm doing God's work, and if you can't believe in me, then maybe you shouldn't come at all." Without another word, he walked out, leaving his father alone, hurt and more suspicious than ever. As Methew stormed away, a small part of him felt powerful, even proud of the respect and influence he'd gained. But his father's words had planted a seed of doubt, one that seemed to grow stronger with every step. He tried to shake it off, but it clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. That Sunday, the church was packed as usual. The congregation waited eagerly, hoping to witness yet another miracle from Prophet Methew. Excitement buzzed in the air as a woman wheeled a crippled man to the front of the church. The man sat in a wheelchair, his legs twisted and frail. The crowd murmured with anticipation, having seen Methew perform miracles before. They believed he could do anything. Methew approached the man, placing his hands firmly on the man's shoulders. He closed his eyes, his voice rising with confidence as he called out, "Rise and walk." His words rang through the church, commanding attention. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see the man stand and walk. But the crippled man remained still, looking up at Methew with confusion. Methew repeated the command, this time louder, feeling the weight of all those expectant eyes on him. "I said, rise and walk, in the name of God." Still, the man didn't move. Whispers of doubt began to ripple through the crowd. Methew's heart pounded in his chest as he tried one last time, his voice echoing through the church, "Get up and walk." His hands trembled, his confidence slipping with each passing second. But the man only looked down, unable to rise. The crowd began to murmur, some people shaking their heads in disappointment. Suddenly, a voice shouted, "He's a fake. He has no power." Others joined in, their voices rising, calling Methew a fraud, questioning the authenticity of his miracles. The respect Methew had worked so hard to build was crumbling right before his eyes. His face flushed with embarrassment and shame. He turned and rushed out of the sanctuary, slamming the door to his office behind him, shutting out the sounds of the angry crowd. Desperate and furious, he whispered through clenched teeth, "Grade 1, Grade 1, Grade 1. Instantly, the old man appeared, standing in the corner of the room, his wicked grin stretching across his face. His eyes gleamed with a cold amusement as he watched Methew. Well, Methew said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's wrong?" The old man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's wrong, Prophet Methew?" Methew clenched his fists, his face flushed with anger. "You foolish old man," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You promised me power in exchange for one sacrifice. I did everything you asked, and now you've taken it away. I was humiliated in front of everyone." The old man's grin faded, his eyes narrowing into a sharp, dangerous gaze. "Watch your tone, Methew," he hissed, his voice icy, "or I will make you blind this very moment." A chill ran down Methew's spine, but his anger kept him steady. The old man continued, his tone calm yet laced with menace. "Power comes with a price, Methew. Did you really think one sacrifice would be enough? Power is hungry, and it needs to be fed. If you want it to stay with you, you must keep feeding it." Methew's heart sank as the weight of the old man's words settled over him. What do you mean?" he stammered, a wave of dread washing over him. The old man's grin returned, darker and more menacing than ever. "You need another sacrifice, Methew. Someone even closer to you." Methew's face turned pale, his heart gripped by a sudden, bone-deep fear. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man's eyes gleamed with sinister joy. "Your father," he said softly, the words like a curse. Methew's knees felt weak, and he shook his head, horrified. "No, not my father. I can't do that." The old man's face darkened, his smile vanishing as he loomed closer. "You have no choice, Methew. You wanted power, didn't you? You wanted respect. Then do as I say. Bring your father as the next sacrifice, or everything you've built will crumble, and people will see you for the powerless fraud you are." Methew felt trapped, torn between his love for his father and his thirst for power. He thought of his father, who had always supported him, even when he had doubts. The idea of harming him filled Methew with a crushing sadness, but the temptation of power clouded his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a heavy fog. The old man leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. "You have 3 days, Methew. If you don't bring your father, I will take everything from you. Your church will fall, and you will suffer. Madness will creep into your mind until you beg for mercy." With those final chilling words, the old man vanished, leaving Methew alone in his office, shaking with fear and confusion. He sank into his chair, his heart pounding, thoughts swirling in a storm of guilt and desperation. Outside, the crowd that once believed in him was now filled with doubt, and the cost of the power he craved was tearing his life apart. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Methew followed the old man's instructions. That evening, he prepared dinner for his father, carefully mixing a special powder the old man had given him into the food. His heart raced as he set the plate in front of his father, who, tired from a long day, sat down to eat. Methew watched, barely breathing, as his father lifted his fork. But just before he took a bite, his father paused, setting the fork down. Bowing his head, he prayed, "Dear Lord, bless this food and keep us safe. Watch over us tonight and protect us from harm." His voice was soft but steady. A jolt of fear shot through Methew. What if his father's prayer was powerful enough to stop the powder? He tried to shake the thought, but as he watched his father eat, worry gnawed at him. After dinner, his father seemed unusually tired, rubbing his eyes and yawning as he got up to head to bed. This must be it, Methew thought, his heart pounding. By morning it will all be over. That night he tossed and turned, barely able to sleep. His mind raced with images of the power he would gain, the respect he would finally have. But as dawn approached, excitement twisted into dread. What if something went wrong? As he sat in the living room, anxiously waiting for news, he heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. His heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly he turned, and to his shock, he saw his father walking toward him, looking perfectly fine, cheerful even. "Good morning, Methew," his father said, stretching and yawning, his face warm with a smile. "Did you sleep well?" Methew's mouth fell open, unable to speak. His mind raced, confusion clouding his thoughts. How is this possible?" he thought, stunned. He managed a shaky response. Good morning, Dad." He forced a smile, trying to hide his shock. His father didn't seem to notice anything strange. Humming a tune, he made himself a cup of tea, completely unaware of Methew's hidden intentions and the turmoil raging inside him. Thoughts, and stay tuned for part 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you won't miss what happens next.